Chapter 20. Jump Scare. In the secondary cargo bay of the Iron Orchid, James settled back against the dark leather of the brass chair. He looked incredibly small, sitting against the rigid metallic hood that curved ominously over his head, but his posture was surprisingly calm. He gripped the polished brass armrests, his dark eyes fixed straight ahead. Finn entered the bay, taking in the scene. He watched the cables pulsing with a faint violet light, where they fed directly from the Orchid's secondary fusion reactor into the amplifier. The hum of the machine was growing steadily louder. Amara stepped up to the control panel Tess had attached to the side of the machine. "Finn, get ready to move the second the gate is open," Amara ordered, her voice tight but professional. She turned her attention to the two kids. Jade was standing close to Ellie, holding her hand tightly. "So, talk me through how this happens. What does Tess need to do first?" James swallowed hard, looking up at the glowing readouts on Tess's datapad. "The machine doesn't open the door," James explained softly, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, red-lit hold. "It just makes it easier for us to push. First, you have to turn the dials until the humming matches the feeling in my head. When it matches, the chair gets warm." Tess frowned, her fingers hovering over her makeshift interface. "Match the feeling in your head?" "Kid, I'm working with raw fusion output and corrupted biometric code. I need a voltage metric, not a feeling. Just slowly increase the power draw to the primary coil," Freya suggested from the far side of the machine. "We have the shunt stabilizing the flow, so it shouldn't fry him. Keep raising it until he says stop." "All right," Tess muttered, carefully adjusting a digital slider on her screen. "Bringing primary power to 10%. Tell me what you feel, James." The machine's humming rose to a high mechanical whine. The violet light in the cables flared brighter. James squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles turning white against the brass armrests. He let out a slow, trembling breath. "More." Tess nudged the slider higher. 20%. "More," James whispered. 30%. Tess called out, the tension in the cargo bay rising with the pitch of the machine. "Kid, we are pulling enough juice to jump a cruiser right now." "Stop," James said suddenly, his eyes flying open. "That's it. It's warm." Finn watched in awe as the brass hood curving over James's head began to emit a faint, shimmering, violet aura. The air around the boy seemed to warp and distort, the red emergency lighting bending strangely around the chair. Amara looked around, noticing Finn standing frozen near the bulkhead, seemingly mesmerized by the events. "Finn, get up to the flight deck," Amara snapped, breaking his trance. "What are you still doing here? Get up there and help Jake." Finn blinked, realizing his mistake. He offered a quick nod and took off at a dead sprint, his boots hammering against the metal grating as he raced up the companionway. Back in the cargo bay, Amara kept her voice incredibly calm despite the terrifying display of raw power radiating from the chair. "Okay, James, what happens next?" "Now," James said, "I find home." He closed his eyes again, his face tightening with absolute concentration. Outside the Iron Orchid, hovering in the dark, silent expanse of the kiln system, the vacuum of space didn't tear or fold. It violently shattered. A sharp, deafening crack of static interference flooded the ship's external comms channels. A spiderweb of brilliant, jagged blue lightning fractured the empty black void directly in front of the blockade runner's nose cone. The tear expanded rapidly, its edges sizzling and spitting violet sparks of energy as the machine forced the fabric of reality apart. The lightning stabilized, forming a massive swirling vortex nearly 200 feet across, easily large enough to swallow the iron orchid whole with room to spare. Finn ran onto the flight deck and dropped heavily into the seat beside Jake. Looking out the reinforced viewport, they didn't see the dark, smog-choked void of Draven or the rusted canyons of Kiln. They saw an endless, glittering expanse of unfamiliar stars hanging over the bright, vibrant blue and green curve of a heavily forested planet, Eloris. Over the internal comms, James grunted, his voice strained and heavy. "I have it! The door is open!" "Jake!" Amara screamed over the ship-wide comms. "Gate is secure! Hit it!" On the flight deck, Jake didn't hesitate. He slammed the primary thrusters to maximum burn. The iron orchid roared, launching forward with bone-crushing acceleration. Down in the cargo bay, Tess and Freya stumbled backwards, grabbing onto nearby crates to keep from being thrown to the deck as the ship aimed itself directly at the massive, swirling blue vortex. They were going to make it. And then, the tactical alarm on the flight deck began to shriek. "Captain!" Jake yelled, his voice panicked as he stared at the flashing red alerts on the console. "We have incoming. Multiple fast movers." "They found the energy scar," Amara swore over the comms. "How close are they?" Before Jake could answer, a violent, deafening explosion rocked the entire ship. The Emerald shuddered violently within the cargo bay, the magnetic clamps groaning in protest as the iron orchid took a direct hit to her rear deflectors. Sparks rained down from the ceiling of the secondary hold, plunging the room into chaotic, strobing darkness. But it wasn't the explosion that made Finn's blood run cold. Over the ship-wide comms, a horrifying, familiar sound echoed through the vibrating hull. It was the same raw, visceral shriek of pure terror Finn had heard in the white cell on Umbrix. The shadows had found them. Down in the cargo bay, the temperature plummeted instantly. The air grew cold, pressing against the crew with the crushing weight of the deep void. Jade let out a piercing scream, throwing her arms around Freya's waist, her small body shaking with absolute terror. "I've got you!" Freya yelled over the roar of the engines, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms tightly around the trembling girl. "I've got you, kid!" Suddenly, another scream echoed through the ship. This one came from the crew quarters. Ellie, who had been fast asleep in the spare bunk, woke with a terrified shriek. "Jake, keep us steady!" Finn roared, abandoning the co-pilot's seat and sprinting off the flight deck. He took the companionway stairs 3 at a time. He burst into the spare cabin just as another violent explosion rocked the Orchid, throwing him hard against the doorframe. Ellie was huddled in the corner of the bed, her hands clamped over her ears, her eyes wide and staring at the empty space near the bulkhead. "Ellie!" Finn yelled, scrambling across the tilting deck to reach her. He grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her into a tight, desperate hug. "I've got you. It's going to be okay." "They're here." Ellie sobbed hysterically, burying her face against his tactical vest. As Finn held her, a sudden, terrifying sensation ripped through him. He couldn't see the shadows. He couldn't hear them, but he could feel them. It was a cold, immense, invisible gravity, pulling relentlessly at the young girl in his arms. It felt as though an invisible hand had wrapped around Ellie's waist and was actively, violently trying to drag her away from him into the dark. Finn gritted his teeth, planting his boots firmly against the frame of the bunk and tightening his grip, physically fighting a cosmic horror he couldn't even see. You aren't taking her! Down in the cargo bay, the situation was just as desperate. Jade screamed again, her feet literally lifting an inch off the deck as the invisible force pulled at her. Tess abandoned the power console, diving across the floor to grab the girl's arm, helping Freya anchor the terrified child to the deck. "Jake!" Amara shouted over the comms, her voice straining as she gripped the side of the heavy brass chair to keep James steady. The boy was bleeding heavily from his nose, his knuckles white as he held the massive gate open against the tearing reality of the void. "Let me know the second we are through." 10 seconds, Jake yelled back, the sound of the Orchid's massive sublight engines screaming in protest as he pushed the heavy blockade runner toward the swirling blue vortex. Another violent blast hit the rear of the ship, alarms blaring a chaotic symphony across every deck. "Hold on," Amara yelled to James, her green eyes fixed on the massive, blindingly bright tear in space looming just outside the cargo doors. "Get ready to close the gate when I say?" James nodded tightly, his eyes squeezed shut in absolute concentration. The Iron Orchid plunged into the swirling blue light. For a fraction of a second, the ship was entirely swallowed by the chaotic, starlit energy of the veil. And then, the beautiful, vibrant green and blue sphere of Aloris filled the viewport. "We're through!" Jake screamed over the comms. "Close it now!" Amara commanded. James gasped, his small hands releasing the brass armrests as he severed his mental connection to the void. The massive, swirling blue vortex behind the Iron Orchid violently collapsed in on itself. It snapped shut with a concussive boom that rippled through the hull. A fraction of a second later, a searing, bright red streak of plasma, a heavy laser blast fired from the scythe, passed harmlessly through the empty, black space where the rear of the Orchid had been a moment before. The gate was closed. Instantly, the freezing, crushing weight in the air vanished. The invisible gravity released its hold. In the spare cabin, Ellie slumped forward against Finn's chest, the tension completely draining from her small body. Down in the cargo bay, Jade sobbed quietly into Freya's shoulder, while Tess let out a long, shaky breath of pure relief. The terrifying silence of normal space rushed back into the ship. Amara slumped against the side of the heavy brass chair, her chest heaving. She reached out, gently wrapping her arm around James in a tight, protective hug. "You did a good job, kid," Amara whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she smoothed his hair. "You did a great job. We're safe now."